Environment Committee. Let me just start by saying, and I think we've got good attendance here, which is awesome. Look, I think the bottom line is, and I think I've said this to many members of the committee privately, is the energy topics, the public utility committee. Let me just area. Oh, I think I'm getting a little back. Okay, everybody, mute yourself because we don't want to get any any event. But the fact is, for most of the members of the committee, the energy topics and the public utility topics are new, with the exception of Augustine, myself, Senator Brooks, and some of the others. So I think it's important. I really felt like now we have one session under our belt. We see some of the issues. Let's loop back and a combination of some webinars, some briefings, some site visits. We're going to obviously go up to PJM headquarters in September. We're going to go to Conowingo Dam in October. We're nailing down a specific date then, and some other things I think in store, which will set us up nicely, I think, to lay a nice foundation for next session on these topics. So, with that backdrop, I know I see several folks from the Public Service Commission here. I think I saw Chair Hoover here. We've got Lisa Smith and some others, but I think we've got Ben. Is Ben here? Ben Baker.
Yes.
Let's start off, Ben, and so Alexis, I think you're going to be running. Lamori is out today. I think Alexis is going to run the slide presentation. Alexis, so you can hear me?
Yep, that's fine.
Okay, so I may yield to you and to Ben to kind of get things started. And so instead of waiting till the very, very end of the presentation, which if we were to just let Mr. Baker roll through, it would probably be a half hour, 40 minutes, maybe 40 minutes. I think it's best as we go through the presentation, if members have questions, let's just throw some questions, raise your hand. Hopefully I'll see you. We'll just do questions as Mr. Baker goes through the presentation. And then when we're at the end, done, we'll be done, as opposed to waiting till the very end and taking questions then. So that said, I'm going to again yield to Mr. Baker. Just before we get going here, whoever's here from the PSC, in addition to Mr. Baker, I see Fred, Chair Hoover. Do you want to make any comments? This is your first time in front of our committee as the newly anointed chair. I saw Commissioner Barve yesterday. We had a nice chat. And I think Lisa Smith is here as well. Who else? I don't know if there's somebody else from the team. I see Brett Sproul here as well. I'm not. Fred, do you want to just some opening comments before we turn it over to Mr. Baker?
Sure. Thank you, Chair Feldman. I want to thank Chair Feldman, Vice Chair Kagan, and the other members of the Education, Energy, and Environment Committee for inviting me to meet with you today in my new role as chair of the Public Service Commission. I just want to make 3 commitments to you. One, that I will attempt to make sure that the commission provides you with straightforward advice on every legislative proposal that you're considering that affects this agency. Secondly, we will do our best to implement the legislation that you pass on the various topics that affect the work of the Public Service Commission. And thirdly, if we come to a conclusion that we need more tools in the toolbox to help do our job on the important issues and responsibilities that you've provided to us, I will be at your doorstep and asking for the authority to help address the issues that we have to deal with, including climate change, energy affordability, and making sure that utility rates are affordable and reliable here in the state of Maryland.
Okay, thank you, Fred. Anything else, Lisa? Anything you want to pipe in on before we get going here?
No, thank you, Chair. Just to mention our team, we also have Kathy Fuston, our Deputy Legislative Director here, in addition to myself. And as you said, Ben Baker will start the presentation and Brett Sproul will wrap us up.
Excellent. Okay. No more delays here. Why don't we turn to you, Ben, and you can get us going, okay?
Sounds good. Thank you, Chair. Alexa, should I, do I have screen sharing privilege?
Sure do.
All right. Let me pull that up. Give me 1 second. All right, good. Nothing else is on the screen. All righty. Oh, wrong way. All right, I'm just going to share that screen as it is. All righty. So thank you for inviting us today. My name is Ben Baker. I'm a senior commission advisor here at the Maryland Public Service Commission. And so I'm just going to walk us through what we do here today and explain the basics of rate making and the system and where our jurisdiction starts and ends. So just brief overview. You just met Chair Hoover, our new anointed chair of the Maryland Public Service Commission. We also have 4 other commissioners. All commissioners serve 5-year terms. If one commissioner is appointed during the middle, let's say a commissioner leaves early and another commissioner takes their slot, they will serve the remainder of that term. When they're appointed, if they're appointed in recess, then they get to serve until the following legislative session when they would be appointed, when they'd be approved by the legislature to be a commissioner. If they're appointed during the session, then they would go through the approval during that process. So anyways, Commissioner O'Donnell and Richard are our 2 longest serving commissioners. And then just this recently, Commissioner Barbay and Sushman both joined us in addition to Chair Hoover. So it's been an exciting time here at the Maryland Public Service Commission. So utility regulation. We at the Maryland Public Service Commission have always had 3 core responsibilities, which is ensuring safe, reliable, and economic service for our public utilities, which would include gas, electric, water, telecommunications, the taxi industry. We also oversee the bay pilots, which are the individuals that help drive the big tanker ships or the big cargo ships into the harbor for offloading. And we also oversee one little toll bridge out in Western Maryland. So that's my fun one. I always like looking at the pictures of that toll bridge. So anyways, in addition to that overseeing of just those core safe, reliable, and economic, we also have other core responsibilities, which would include environment, which would include public safety, which is underneath that safe idea, which also we also have meeting our state's climate goals within our agenda. So we have a number of items whenever we are reviewing a utility application or an application in front of us that we need to consider when deciding if it's in the public's interest to approve what is being requested of us. When we're talking about the electric and gas utilities, which is who we're going to focus on today, the regulatory compact between them is basically they need to provide this safe, reliable, and economic service subject to our state goals and other guiding principles. And in exchange, they get an exclusive franchise in specific locations throughout our service territory where your constituents are. And they are given an opportunity, not a guarantee, but an opportunity to recover their cost and with a fair rate of return. And so the process to determine what that return is, what those appropriate costs are done through rate cases, which we will discuss in a little. But basically, it's a long trial that will be to basically determine what those rates should be for the customers. And so then on top of that, as the chair was pointing out in his opening remarks, our authority is vested to us through the laws you write and pass, and then the governor signs. And so our governing, supervisory powers are in the Public Utilities Article and 2-113, if you ever want to go through the list of things that we need to consider when looking at utility applications in general. And so anyway, that's how our powers and what we are allowed to do and what we are guided to do are given to us, because we are not a policy agency. We are a quasi-judicial economic agency who's independent in terms of our commissioners. And so we look to the legislature, we look to the governor for the policies, the state policies that might guide where we go. So the next section, before we can really get into rate making and getting into kind of the what we charge our customers, we have to think about what are the operations of the electric and gas systems and how they are designed, because that really does a couple things. One, that this helps us kind of get, and I'm going to show you a picture here in a couple minutes that's going to give you a good visual representation of where our authority is basically over these systems. But so it's not just us, Maryland, who oversee us, the PSC, that oversees these operations of delivering energy to our customers. It's also, there's a federal component, and also there's a deregulated component. So it's a pretty intricate system. It's pretty cool also at the same time, because you basically have these massive little machines, not little, they're massive machines running in the background that no one ever thinks about. And because you just turn on your stove, you turn on your lights, and it turns on. So our regulatory is over what we call the distribution system, and that would be the local lines that you see running across the streets. They're small, and basically this is where basically the most micro level of the energy grid. And so that's what we have all ultimate authority over. But that is not typically where we get our power from. That's basically the wires that are used to deliver the power. Where the power comes from is through the wholesale market, which is where generation / you also hear the word supply sometimes used occur, and transmission. And so over those sources, we have a little less authority. Really, that is predominantly overseen by federal entities such as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who's basically our federal counterpart. They do a lot of the same work we would do, but federally. And the entity they regulate is called PJM, which is basically an economic organization that basically oversees the operations of the wholesale markets and the dispatching of generation and the planning of generation and transmission to ensure that there's enough power for all the states within the PJM. And I guess I should back up for a minute. The PJM is a big organization that spans 13 states. And the PJM, basically, they basically have the ability to say, we need a generator built here to ensure that we have energy reliably served. And they also ensure that we have a fair and competitive market for generation and transmission. And so,
hey, Ben, I'm going to interrupt because we already have a question coming in. And again, I think as we go through, I think Senator Washington has a sort of a more up threshold scope question to put out there. So why don't we, we're going to go to Senator Washington for a question.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you for coming to speak with us today and helping us understand. I have a question about the complaints, so you talked about the regulation of the utilities and your commitment to our climate goals and all of that. But I was reading through your 2022 annual report, and I was wondering, so how does that work in terms of your receipt of complaints, or how do you follow up or address if constituents have concern?
Yeah, definitely.
And where does that authority come from? So that's again just big picture, not a
Right. Yeah, no. I'll be honest, I don't know where the authority comes from. I assume it's within those supervisory powers, but I will, if Lisa or somebody knows where the authority comes from, I definitely could be educated there. But in terms of our process, I'm very happy to speak to that. Okay. We have a consumer affairs division within the commission whose sole purpose is to interact with the public, receive complaints, and review them to determine is there an issue that needs to be resolved. And typically what they're reviewing is both the law that, like the public utilities article, our utilities have what we call tariffs, which are basically and the tariff is a contract between the utility and the customer, and the tariff is something that we approve. So anytime they want to change that document, they have to come to us for approval. And so they will review all this material and look at what the customer is saying, and look at what the utility is saying, and then make a judgment decision if if there's something that needs to be remediated. And so they will have letters going back and forth, and we have a process online. Typically, though, the process is first we ask, did you try and work with the utility? If they didn't, we say, okay, please make one attempt at least with the utility. If you're being unresponsive, though, come back to us for sure, certainly. And so after that, though, once that's happened, once we've had that threshold, did you work with the utility? It enters our CAD process. If the customer is unhappy with the CAD process, they can appeal, in which case that comes to a higher level. Either the commissioners or one of our pool J's, public utility law judges who have authority to help make decisions here, we'll review the case and determine if there's something that should be happening. And that is a very formal process. We have some informal processes that sometimes if we can handle it on the side, we'll work with the customer directly to see if we can resolve the issue. Sometimes we'll get those requests through your offices, and we'll see what we can do there to resolve a customer complaint or a concern informally too. Sometimes we'll try and do it that way.
Senator Washington, just to jump in to add on, the authority is in the public utility article. There are provisions for the formal complaint process, and basically, as Ben said, the commission also delegates to the Consumer Affairs Division, and the specific process Ben described is all outlined in COMAR. So those are commission regulations that have been promulgated and updated that outlines that very formal process that Ben described. Hopefully that helps.
Yes, and then continue.
Well, just to tie up the final loose end. So the commission has overall supervisory authority over the regulated utilities. So the distribution companies that provide the electricity. Under the 1999 Deregulation Act, there was a whole suite of authority that was given to the Public Service Commission regarding the retail supply industry. And so regulations have been developed for the practices that they do. Some of that authority has been changed over the years during the process of dealing with retail suppliers. But all of the authority we have is granted by the General Assembly, and it's in the Public Utilities article.
Thank you, Chair Hoover. And so just a final, so it's reactive. In other words, is there a investigative division, or is it simply you wait for a complaint, you receive and you respond to what you receive? So it's a reactive process.
Well, it's twofold actually.
Yes.
So we have, a division that responds to complaints from customers, both either against regulated utilities or the retail suppliers. However, our staff is charged with, in its supervisor of both the regulated utilities and the retail suppliers, to look for patterns and practices. So we have the ability to conduct investigations if we become aware of an issue or problem or something like that. And so and with the retail supply industry, the staff has actually led some investigations against some of these companies for violations of the existing laws and regulations, and brought some of these cases before the commission.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I think Senator Kagan did also had a question regarding how many complaints. Maybe I'll yield to Senator Kagan. She just, I think, wanted to put out there the scope of how many complaints in a given year consumer complaints, that is, do we get? Senator Kagan, did you want to?
You said it. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want an idea of the volume that you're talking about with these complaints.
Lisa or Kathy, do you have that number offhand, or should I get it from?
We can pull it up and get it. I don't know that we know off the top of our head.
I mean, roughly, we're talking about 15. We're talking about 4,000 a year.
Probably more in the hundreds to thousands or low thousands. It's not going to be. Yeah, it's not going to be in the tens, unfortunately, though that would be wonderful.
Yes.
Point of information, Senator Kagan, in the 2022 report, it was 1,726 complaints that they received.
Thank you, Senator Washington. As always, very thorough and prepared. Thank you. And then the follow-up is roughly how long does it take to navigate and address a consumer complaint? If one of our constituents is in touch with us and we guide them to you, what can we tell them about the expectation for how long it's going to be?
Ben, I'll start, because the legislative division will handle anything coming from the senator's offices, and we attempt first, like Ben said, we attempt to resolve it directly. If there's any case in which it's not necessary to have someone fill out all the forms and portals online, we will, Ben, I think your whole screen is showing, just in case you want to keep the presentation up. So we will try to take the information that's necessary to kind of resolve the complaint. And we also do ask folks sometimes to at least give us an email that we will, enough information that we'll input, and because as Chair Hoover said, we are always looking for those patterns and practices. So it's really important if folks don't tell us, it's hard for us to know that there are 100 complaints about the same thing. We might have only heard 2. So we're always encouraging anything we can get. We are tracking trends all the time about certain companies, certain practices, and the Consumer Affairs Division is actually intervening with the company contacts all the time, trying to stay on top of any issues before they become really big. However, if a formal complaint is filed, sometimes we'll say, we really need a formal complaint here. We need our engineering division to go out and investigate or something like this. And we do get the complaint uploaded on the portal. There's basically, it's all outlined in COMAR, but there's 30 days for the company to respond and then another 30 days. So it's it takes a few months for the process to play out. Oftentimes we can get it resolved during that process, get any refunds that are owed the customer and stop it there. However, there is due process. Even for the customer, they can appeal if they're not satisfied with the decision. So of course, if they end up appealing up to the commission because they're dissatisfied with the initial decisions within the consumer affairs, that can obviously extend the timeline. And then from there, you have due process rights to appeal in court. So of course, there are those rare cases that can take longer because of all of those steps.
And Lisa, is it okay if I add on here?
Go ahead.
Quick?
Come on, Brett.
So, good morning, everyone. I'm Brett Sproul. I'm one of the technical advisors for the commissioners. I appeared in front of you all last legislative session for various net metering and community solar bills, and I just wanted to shed some light. So regarding Senator Kagan's question on the consumer affairs, the amount of complaints that we get, internally we do get a bi-weekly brief from our CAD division that kind of runs down the complaints that we're seeing. Typically those are within the 50 to 100 complaints per bi-weekly, which as you all stated, can range between the low thousands, high hundreds. And furthermore, as Lisa said, as advisors and myself and Ben Baker previously being on multiple levels of technical staff, we do try to keep our ear to the ground for a lot of these issues to try to stay as proactive as possible. So those are just the 2 points that I wanted to add there.
And then to wrap it up, Senator Kagan, to answer your first and main question, which is timelines. I don't have the exact one, but my familiarity with the process is a couple weeks to a couple months, depending on the issue. But what I will say, and so during that though, if it's a bill dispute, so let's say the customer is disputing what they paid on their bill, they are not obligated to pay that portion of their bill. They still have to continue making payments on the disputed portion of the bill, but the disputed portion, they are not required to make a payment until it's resolved. So I do know our CAD division it strives to get these things turned over quickly, but I do know there are technical ones that get dragged on, and so that's sometimes it's kind of devil's in the details of the complaint. But I do know that we try and resolve them as quickly as possible. But I would say I've seen a couple weeks to a couple months, depending on the issue.
Thank you all. And again, thank you, Senator Washington. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, before we go back to you, Mr. Baker, Sarah Washington, your hand is still up. Are we good? Or okay? Okay, Ben, why don't you proceed forward here?
Yes, thank you. So I would say for the FERC, for PJM, just know that they oversee a large swath of states that are near us. And there's 13 of them, plus the District of Columbia, and that is the wholesale bulk transmission and grid and utility. I call it utility scale generation. It's also some wholesale generation. So really big power plants in the 50 plus megawatt range. Anyway, so that and they set the rate into that. That's where that is set. Where our powers are within this area, we have authority over the siting of generation and transmission within Maryland. So if somebody wants to build a power plant or a transmission line in Maryland, they would go through what's called the CPCN process, Certificate of Public Necessity and Convenience. And so that has to go through review there to determine if they can or cannot build it. There's obviously waivers and exceptions to that process, but that's one of our main things. Another one is our utilities. So as the chair was referring to, we have retail choice in Maryland. So you don't have to pay the utility for generation and transmission. You can buy that from a third party. And so who can buy the power directly from the wholesale market. And so that rate that is charged by the retail choice provider, we do not oversee the rate. We do oversee their actions, but we don't regulate their rate. There is an exception there. For low income supply customers, there was a law recently passed, and we actually just stood up the COMARs as of July 1st. No supplier can enter into a contract with a low income customer who's basically an OHEP customer was the determination, who's been OHEP in the last 24 months, unless they have an approved contract with us that's below the utility's regulated supply and transmission rates. And so that is one area where we do now have rate authority over the retail choice community. But otherwise, we also would set the default rate if you choose not to be with a retail choice provider. And so we have a very standardized process for the setting of that rate for our large investor-owned utilities. We do give our gas utilities and some of our smaller utilities more flexibility in how they procure their energy. But that goes through an annual review process to make sure that it was competitively procured. So let's see here, going to the next slide. Yeah, I just walked through FERC and PJM, so we can skip right over them. Visual representation. I have pictures tell the story much better than I ever will. So on one side, and we have a little dashed line here in the middle of the page to delineate effectively what I would say the distribution system from the transmission and generation system. But that also, I think, is a good way of delineating our jurisdiction, the Maryland Public Service Commission's jurisdiction, and the PJM FERC jurisdiction. And so what you're seeing here basically is just a visual representation of what I was walking through. You have your generators, which can be solar, wind, coal, nuclear, anything really that can spin and make electrons, or not spin in the case of solar, but basically make electrons is going to be on that side for the most part, and I'll get into that in a second. And then we have these big, massive wires. They're going to be kind of out in the middle of nowhere, these generators, and so we got to move a lot of this power. And so you're going to hear words like 500 kilovolts, 220 kilovolts. Those really, all that means is really big wires, and that is not under we might have siting authority for that in Maryland, but ultimately the PJM oversees those transmission wires and those generation assets. Now, if we come over to the distribution side, historically, and I think that might have been some of my bias here when I've been discussing some of this with you, historically, energy has been flowing in one direction, from the generators down the transmission wires into the distribution system. And so basically it would reach the distribution system and it would get pushed out to all the houses, into the buildings that needed it. But with the advent of distributed energy resources, that is no longer the case. So you can install solar on your house. You could put a storage unit there on your house. You could theoretically also, I guess, have some small diesel generators, but we don't really see that unless we're talking about a big commercial customer who needs combined heat and power, is what you'll hear that as called. But those units could generate energy and feed that back onto the grid. And so that's been one of the new advents within let's say the last 10, 20 years it's been, and probably a little longer than that, figuring out how to make that work. And also constructing a system to handle that. And so you'll also hear electric vehicles may or may not be able to integrate with this setup one day. We call it vehicle to grid. It hasn't really happened yet here in Maryland, but it's an idea that we might be able to use your car as a mini battery to help with the grid's operations. So anyway, so that's a really cool new thing where basically the consumer can be more participatory within the I guess electric grid. Also, sometimes the best electron is electron that was never used, energy efficiency, plug for Empower. So basically, we have a program where we basically incentivize customers to buy more energy efficient products, and they can install them at their homes, which will then reduce the need for electricity on the grid overall, and therefore making it probably a little cheaper to serve our customers. A couple things before I move on from here. When we're planning the distribution system, it's all about that peak. And so what we care about is, from a planning perspective, a lot of the engineers, they really worry more about how much energy is being consumed all at a single moment in time. So it's also referred to as demand, peak load. What they're concerned about is basically everyone turning all their lights on at the same time, charging your electric vehicle at the same time, running your AC, and basically putting a high stress on the grid such that it might blow a fuse. And I like to think of the grid sometimes in a very simplistic thing is sort of like your circuit box of your house. You try and plug too many things into a wall socket at once, it will flip the fuse box, and you got to go down to your breaker and flip and reset your fuses. The grid is like that on a much bigger scale. And so they will be on the distribution system trying to make sure that they can manage those peaks over time. And they're thinking both about the local peaks, and they're also thinking about the overall system peak. And it's not just on the distribution system they're thinking about this. They also think about it on the generation system. And they have whole market products, and you might hear of capacity payments, where basically we are paying the generators in this wholesale market are receiving payments to ensure that they are available whenever I need them. And so I think of it as like an insurance product, where basically I'm making sure that in case I have really bad weather I didn't plan for, that generator still needs to be available. I paid you a little more than I paid you for you to do that. So I gave you a little bit of a special contract, but when that happens, I expect you to turn on. And that's something that's overseen by the PJM.
And
questions before go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, I was just going to add a quick point of clarification a little bit. I think one thing, and for record, I have a background in economics. I think one thing that's sometimes useful to understand, especially when considering the peak demand and peak load that Ben had mentioned, is that for the overall electricity grid, when you think about supply and demand of goods, that you can have demand side issues and supply side issues. For the electricity grid, it's quite unique that your supply effectively has to meet demand at near all times, or else you can run into issues. So with that being said, I think that hopefully adds more context. So whenever there's, as Ben mentioned, peak demand, you have to make sure that you have capacity to supply and meet the residents' demand at that instantaneous point of time.
And I think that, and Brett, thank you for jumping on with that instantaneous, because that is a very unique thing to electricity that is not this, which is a little different than gas. But and so that there are literally, when you turn on the light, there's a generator somewhere else on the grid that's going to work instantaneously, just a little bit harder to serve that electron. And so it's an interesting thing, and that is also why energy storage one day is hopefully going to be the key that's going to help us manage and unlock renewables potential to a greater extent. Because what's another thing from electricity perspective, and one of the difficulties with it, it's a problem in a sense that it's just not something we're used to working with, but it's a problem that can be solved. It's just the fact that solar and wind and renewables typically, they will generate when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. While coal and nuclear, they will generate when I need them to. And so storage has kind of been viewed as this, as kind of the holy grail thing that I need to find the cheap version of it to unlock the renewables full potential to help me manage my grid. Now, that being stated, I don't think we have an Armageddon situation currently with renewables and the fact that they're not dispatchable. It's just as we get to higher levels of renewables on the grid, that'll be part of the cost, and something we need to think about is how are we going to manage at a higher level of renewable penetration on the grid, the fact that I need electrons to be served instantaneously. So that's just a thing that we'll have to think about over time, and that the industry is working on right now. So other questions on the electric grid before I jump into the gas grid?
I thank you for that opportunity. I was trying to follow and wanting to understand this last piece very clearly. So unlike other utilities, these providers it has to be available. It can't shut down. You can't say I ran out of energy, basically. Would that be a way of?
Yeah, because if you do, the lights go off. So
right.
Yeah.
Right, and it's not coming back until next week unless there's something catastrophic that's unexpected. But as regular practice, you can't run out of supply. So because of that, I'm just stating it back, making sure I understand. For that guarantee, we pay a premium when they have to supply. I guess that's the part. When
So the capacity market.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's break it into two parts. So in the wholesale market, there's 3 buckets of revenues that generators can earn. One is energy. Just I am generating whenever the need for whenever a customer turns on a light, and so there's various energy products available. To serve customers' needs. And so that's how you and me would think about it, as just over time, I'm using electricity and the generation is going to be flowing and serving my needs over time. The second is ancillary services. Those ancillary services are used to correct the grid, because the grid is basically, we're basically trying to find ways to compensate the generators for attributes that might not be inherently seen by you and me. So we care about power quality, and so we might pay them to act in a certain manner. We might pay them to correct the power on the system, or in order to it's not that the grid operator in that moment in time is always thinking they're only paying. It's not that they're just looking 1 second ahead and determining what they need. They're forecasting out into the future, and so we're actually running an energy bidding process a day ahead of time, 5 minutes ahead of time. And then the ancillary services kick in, and they're used to correct for the minute mistakes within those forecasts. So we pay generators for that as well. And then finally, this is getting to your question, the capacity. So that's where basically the PJM is going to look out over time and say, I need X amount of megawatts available in the future, because based off of my forecast. And so in order to ensure that the generators have a financial incentive to be there and to serve the load, I'm going to run a capacity auction where basically they say, this is what I need. Everyone come and give me your bids. Mm-hmm. And so all these generators are going to basically look at their bottom lines, and they're going to calc out what they think they need to basically get paid to show up in the future, because maybe they're not making enough money through the energy markets, maybe they're not in the ancillary service markets. So this is another price component of ensuring that the generation will be available in the future. And so it is, I guess it feels like we're paying a premium, and sometimes we are to ensure it. But I will say all utility systems have to plan for excess generation, because in the future. And so a typical reserve margin, a historical reserve margin, is you say, what is my peak in the future? I need 15% more I need 15% more in terms of generation to serve that peak, to account for generators having unplanned outages and for me being bad at my forecasting job. And so they will, and so that margin should be on every single system. So in California, they might not use a capacity auction. Instead, they will go out and sign contracts directly with the generators. Here we use an auction. Some systems like Texas, I don't know, back in the day they did it, but then you had the winter storm problem, and I'm not sure. I think they were changing to focus a little more on that, but I'm not 100% sure. But here in Maryland, we use that capacity auction to basically make up that difference.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, Ben, why don't you go for it? I should note as we go through, some of the issues you touched on, we have folks who've been out front, out of the committee. I wanted to shout out to Senator Washington. You mentioned that exception for low income folks. That was actually a Senator Washington initiative, energy storage. Senator Augustine took the lead this session with some legislation. So we're trying to keep on top of this within the committee, but I'll put that out there. Ben, back to you.
No, thank you. That's a good point. Yes, and I've definitely worked with a couple of you on some of the initiatives that we have here, and I look forward to continuing to do that. So natural gas. The difference between natural gas and electricity in terms of, if I'm thinking about from a planning purpose, is going to be about pressures. So basically, once again, the distribution planners for gas, they are also concerned about peak consumption of gas on the system. But what they're worried about is basically ensuring that they have enough pressure to push their gas out. So it's not that they're just worried about supply, they're worried about pushing enough gas through the system, through those pressures. So I hope, think of it as somebody one time told it to me as, Ben, think of it as if you poked a balloon and you opened up a hole. You now need to push more air through to keep the balloon full with that little hole, and so to maintain the balloon staying inflated. And so that's kind of maybe some very simplistic way to think of the gas grid. All analogies fall apart eventually. So anyway, similar to electricity, gas has a supply component, a transmission component, and a distribution component. So on the supply side, that would really be where the gas is getting drilled out of the ground, pumped up, and it's going to get treated to separate into a bunch of different products, propane, butane, oil. They are basically separating that, and they're going to create a bunch of different products that will get sold to various industries to be used for their needs. One of those would be natural gas. But the thing about natural gas is that when you're pumping it out of the ground, it's going to have a whole bunch of nasty stuff in it that's, well, not good for us, nor is it good for the gas system. And so they are going to treat that gas to get it to the right chemical balance, such that when it goes through the gas system, it's not corroding or messing up their pipes. And so that it goes through a process of refinement. And then you have things like compressor, because once again, you got to make sure you can push it out to the grid. Now, gas flows a lot slower than electricity. It's not going to move instantaneously. It's going to move more in terms of like feet per second, not hundreds of miles in an instance. And so we will have storage units along the way where basically you'll have big caverns where they will put gas along the system, or they might have big pill tanks along the way to store gas in terms of its need. And that's to keep it close to the system. And also that means that we are entering into contracts for gas further out in the future to make sure that you can have the supply you need to serve your customers. So anyways, this is happening on the transmission system and is also happening on the distribution system. And so once it gets to our utility, the term of the day for that would be gate station. That's basically a transfer point. That's just basically the handshake between the transmission system and the distribution system to switch the gas over to the distribution system. So that's just basically the pipe that connects the two, that brings it into the utility system where they might store it, but they would also then serve it to their various customers. And so along the way, the utilities, depending on their gas system, are going to be stepping up or reducing the pressure on that gas to appropriately flow it to their customers. And so anyways, that's where we have oversight of the utilities, is basically their purchasing habits of the gas, and basically the delivery of it in their pipes and everything else. So similar to electric, but we don't set the utilities distribution rates for gas, or not distribution rates, my apologies, supply rates for gas nearly as I would say, we give them a little more of a rein in terms of how they set that rate, though we do a review once a year to make sure it was competitively set and procured. And so what I'm saying there is basically we still regulate the supply rate charged by the gas utilities, but instead of going through what I would call a more, I guess, preset process with our electric utilities, we allow the gas utilities to have a little bit more flexibility in their procurement practices, but they are still reviewed and approved by us every year. So I'll stop there for a minute. Questions on the gas grid?
Okay, we've got Senator Brooks has a question. Senator Brooks, unmute you. There you
go. Okay. Yeah. Yes, Ben. You're on the gas. So you're talking about the latitude that you give them. What about the infrastructure costs? Is there a rate case made for that?
Yes. Yes. So both the utility, so for all distribution costs, both electric and gas, they have to go through a rate case with us. And so basically within a rate case, you open up the utilities books. We have our technical staff will go through it. The Office of People's Counsel, who is basically the residential ratepayers advocate, will go through it. And then anyone else, any other intervener may go through those books and determine, do they agree with the spend or did they think there was something imprudent? And then we will all go through that and determine what is the total amount of cost that should be recoverable by the utility. And in addition, during that process, we're focused on rates of return and the rate setting for the distribution rate. I think what mostly I was getting to is what the difference I was trying to draw between electric and gas there was we do a bidding process for electricity where we basically sit in the room with the utilities to receive competitive bids to set the SOS rate that is charged. For gas sales service, the utility is allowed to go out and buy and procure their gas, but then it's more of an after the fact review, which is more similar to what I just described for a distribution rate case. So that was the distinction I was trying to draw between the two. But in both sets, we have full authority over that and the rates they charge and full review over both of those.
All right. And earlier when you were talking about electricity, you were saying that the companies have you give them an opportunity to recover a fair rate. Now that, I mean, is that a market rate or, I mean, what is that based on? Dun & Bradstreet or what?
Yeah, so the utility is given an opportunity to earn a fair rate of return. So what we do is we first determine what plant was prudently built. Once that's been determined, they will get cost recovery of the actual cost of that plant. Now, but also you wouldn't be in business if you couldn't make a little cash. And so that's where we now got to get into what is their revenue, what their rate of return is. And so during the rate case, we will have witnesses get up and say, I'm looking at the stock market for publicly traded utility companies or companies similar to the publicly utility traded companies. I think this is the return on equity that the utility should be given an opportunity to return. And that standard was set through, and so this idea though of a fair rate of return was set through two Supreme Court cases from the early 1900s. One's called, and they're called Hope and Bluefield, which basically said we had to look at comparable companies to the utility, and utilities are not allowed to earn excessive returns that one might expect of a competitive business, but they should be given an opportunity to earn a fair rate of return, which is in the eye of the beholder, which would be the commission here. And so during that rate case, the utility will have a witness, our technical staff will have a witness, typically the Office of People's Counsel will have a witness, and then others might chime in as well. But basically they're looking at financial projection models, or they're looking at financial models to say, here's what I think that fair rate of return is based off of current market conditions.
Okay. All right, Chair, one final question too. Ben, as we gravitate toward net neutrality, I'm hearing talk about the utility companies, making tremendous investments in infrastructure so far as gas is concerned. Is that something that one would say that is prudent at this time as we are trying to gravitate from fossil fuels?
Are you saying, did you say I heard net neutral in there, but maybe I misheard you.
Yeah, as we gravitate toward that, we're trying to get away from fossil fuels into
Okay, so
into renewables. Yeah.
okay.
And the companies are, from what I read, that the utility companies are making tremendous investments into the infrastructure, so far as pipelines and whatnot. So
Right.
yeah.
So that's actually a point of contention within the rate case. So I can't actually get into what I think around it because I have to advise them on it. But I will say this. It's something that is being looked at all levels, because I think, so we have a study currently that, so the Climate Solutions Now Act a couple of years ago, we are on the hook to produce a study, and we're working on it, that basically says, here is what we think the electric grid will look like in 10 years, and also the gas grid is part of that. So basically we're studying the utilities grids in a high electrification world. We also have another, once again, the Climate Solutions Now Act, we're going to get a new pathway from the Maryland Department of Environment that is going to also say, here's how we think we're going to meet the future climate goals. And so I think there's a lot of planning and thinking about what that is going to look like. But in terms of the prudency argument, I can't probably get into that today, but it is something that I can tell you is being thought about long and hard and is actively being litigated in front of this commission.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, we're going to go to Senator Kagan. I would note, Senator Brooks, that some of this investment front loading, that was the result of legislation that was passed in the General Assembly some point. Something obviously is controversial at this point, but in any event, Senator Kagan, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ben, I have a request and then a question. The request, I just want to remind you that first off, a lot of us are learning this and hearing it for the first time. And so if you can try not to do the acronyms, the other part of our audience might be people watching at home or the press or something. So some of these acronyms may be getting by a lot of us. So if you can try, that'd be helpful. My question about this slide, I have two questions. One is, can you speak to the vulnerability? You said miles and miles and it takes a while and stuff. From production through distribution, is there at any point that gas lines, can you talk about the vulnerability of gas lines to bad actors or to inadvertent, errors, problems, construction workers or blah, blah, blah. And then second, could you talk about the environmental impact or community impact as the gas is traveling from its source to its ultimate destination?
Yeah, definitely. So vulnerability, starting with bad actors, that's going to be a concern both for the electric and the gas grid. If somebody wants to attack this infrastructure, they could go for it, and the utilities have to safeguard it. I do know, like you'll sometimes read in the news people literally shooting at electric substations.
That started.
I've never heard, and so exactly, and so our utilities are putting infrastructure in to protect against bad actors coming after it, but that is a risk, whether it be the electric grid or the gas grid. In terms of now accidental damage on the gas grid, that can happen on the transmission system. It could also happen on our local system. A typical thing that happens on the local system is a construction worker is not aware of a gas line underground, or there was a mismarking of a line under the ground, and they're excavating and they accidentally hit the line. That is that has led to explosions before. Sometimes equipment does fail. One example of that was the Flower Branch a couple of years ago, where we inside a multi-unit residential dwelling. A gas regulator failed, which basically was filling up the building with gas, and it was located in a location where people weren't really going to be able to smell it. And so there was an explosion, which then led to legislation passed by this body that said, no, we want those things out for those buildings. We want them outside for multi-unit dwellings. And so that was another example of gas equipment failure on the system. I would say in general, we do environmental concerns that you were speaking to. Yes, I would say the gas system is in various parts of the system older or newer, but it's basically a bunch of, if you ever have a chance to look at your plumbing inside the house, It's going to look probably like, I don't say it's going to look exactly like that, but that's what you basically have. You have a bunch of pipes that are coupled at joints. And so that's where those joints are, you have a chance for escape. If the metal is corroding, there's chance for leaks coming out through the pipe. And so our gas utilities are going around, they're trying to find places where they're detecting these leaks to fix it. And I think this might be getting to what Senator Feldman was speaking to. A lot of that comes through our STRIDE program, which was originally established in 2012 or 2013, that basically said, okay, utilities, there is piping in the ground that, though it might not be yet at the end of its useful life, it would be better than not to get it out and replace it. And one of those components was we want it out because it would be a little safer. We want it out because it would help reduce emissions because of leaks, and a couple other factors. And so through that STRIDE program, our utilities have identified higher risk piping that they're working on. But at the end of the day, that the fact that you do have leaks on the gas grid, you will see emissions there as well. And so those could occur at any point along the system, whether it be our utilities or utilities further up the transmission gas utilities that are moving the bulk sale. Now, I will say finally at the wellhead, there's always they will in with the well. Sorry, let me go back. Where they produce gas, that is also called the wellhead. That is there will be some escape of leaks there, and so the ways that is managed is either the company in charge of that location might put a lot of infrastructure into lock down those emissions, and then the new term for that one's called certified natural gas, which the gas companies are going around and basically saying we're paying a little bit extra to ensure at the generation source, the supply source, they're not leaking as much. Those locations will also engage in flaring to basically burn off escaping gas, which would convert it from methane to carbon. It reduces to CO2, which has a lower emissions footprint. And so that's another thing is if the natural gas escapes as methane, it's going to emit more greenhouse gases.
Quick follow-up question, if I could, Mr. Chair. Just wondering, is it the PSC's responsibility or someone else, or is the utility's responsibility to get out the before you dig dial 811? Who does that, and how effective is it? Is it ignorance or error? The construction breaking into the lines.
I don't know how much is either, but I think we have both occur on the system. I think that, but it is the utility's job on before you dig, and the customer calls in, but getting the messaging out, the utility gets the messaging out. I know I would advocate everyone call before you dig, and that goes for both electric and gas utilities. Because you could have the same thing where somebody strikes an electric line that's been buried
Sure.
too. So you have similar risk in terms of customers hitting utility infrastructure, especially if it's underground, in terms of that failure. And so it's just when the gas system fails, you'll have an explosion. When the electric system fails, sometimes you all have a fire, but more likely it'll just be the lights are out until it's fixed. And so there's a different magnitude of risk when there's a failure on one of those two systems.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I'll stop there.
And Senator Kagan, this is Lisa. I believe the Maryland Underground Prevention Authority oversees the rules on that as well. I think there's been some legislation that's come before, maybe not your committee specifically, but your predecessor committee in recent years. And I just wanted to mention too, there's a lot of discussions going on about the emissions within the home for the gas customers. Of course, we really are at the intersection of addressing climate change and affordability, because we know it's quite expensive to electrify. So I know that the PSC is trying to work with MDE, Maryland Department of Environment, and with Maryland Energy Administration that oversees the grants, and with the utilities, and we're all trying to think about creative ways that we can address that, especially for low and moderate income folks.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Appreciate it.
And actually, just to add one last thing, ever since 9/11, there's been an increased responsibility by both the federal government and state government and the industry regarding protection of the infrastructure, whether it's pipelines or transmission lines or distribution systems. Originally, it was focused on the hardware. Now, lately, it's been focused on the digital aspect of it, the cybersecurity thing. But there are levels of organizations, both at the federal government level and within the industry, that are charged with overseeing protection of both of these systems to make sure that they're not subject to any threats as far as causing disruption.
Okay, excellent. I would note that I wasn't trying to be cryptic. It was the STRIDE bill event. I was referencing that we passed in 2013 that let the gas utilities get accelerated recovery as they were replacing aging infrastructure at that time. And then Lisa, on the underground facility reform bill, that actually, I was the sponsor of the bill. It came out of the Finance Committee about 2 sessions ago. So we did do some reforms. It was a pretty significant bill a couple of sessions ago out of the Finance Committee that I sponsored. Okay, with that, Ben, are you coming to some closure? I know that we have a second part to the presentation. I want to be respectful. Why don't you get through the rest of your section, and then we have a second part.
So I'm leading up to the rate case where me and Brett will both go back and forth on that, and that will get us into the bill. So wholesale versus retail choice, just to briefly recap that, because we already did discuss it a little bit. Basically, we have the PJM market where our utilities or other third parties will basically engage in the financial transactions to buy the electricity and the gas. And so basically they're taking on the financial commodity risk of buying that, and then they're going to turn around and sell it to the consumer. And so the utility rates are regulated by us, both the electric and gas, that they charge back to the customer. But if you choose not to buy from the utility, you can buy it from a retail choice provider. As I was saying earlier, they set their own rates unless we're dealing with a low income supply offer. And they can charge that to the customer through the contracts they set up between them and the customer. And that retail choice was set up through restructuring back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, which is when we divested our utility, because our utilities used to be vertically integrated. When I say vertically integrated, they owned everything from the generation down to the distribution system. But back in the late 1990s, we said, you're going to sell your distribution assets to your generation assets to third parties for this market. And so anyways, that is also at the same time when we stood up the retail choice market as well. Okay, getting into rate setting, which will be me and Brett. So go ahead. I see Senator Washington has a hand up.
Since you raised it, we should note in your 2022 report that a little more than a third of the complaints from the public were about third-party energy suppliers. And I think currently you have before you a petition, I believe it's the Maryland Advocates Coalition, requesting that the purchase of receivables for retail choice be eliminated. I think the so can you tell, is the PSC currently accepting comments on that petition?
Yeah.
And can you explain, again, this is new to us, what is a petition and what's this process?
Yeah, definitely.
Ben, we can keep it, sorry, the attorney over here. We can keep it to procedural. Probably can't get
that's what I mean,
procedural,
right, yes.
Yeah, thank you, Senator.
That's fair.
Yeah, so let me make sure I get the, so for somebody to petition the commission, they just have to make a filing with us and say, I have these concerns. And they can say, we would like to see XYZ action. So in the case of the energy advocates, they said, we think that purchase of receivables is a concern. Commission, here is our proposed solution. The commission took that and said, okay, we looked at the administrative schedule and decided, when can we fit this in? And said, okay, we would like you to, we docketed it for comments, and we said, okay, anyone who has any opinions on this, come to us with your views in writing. And then we basically said, we'll decide what we want to do after that. So it really depends on the request and the issue. So if a utility makes a rate case petition to us, well, under law, we have 7 to 10 months to get the rate case done. And so we have a very set procedure for how we handle that. If it's not a rate proceeding, but a utility, any utility files what we call a tariff change with us, which is basically changing that contract between them and the customer. We give it 30 days, but we can also suspend it longer. But basically that would go through our administrative process. So if I break into so there's basically three parts to somebody making a petition to us. One is the utilities and their rates, which get put into a very specific process where it goes to a case, and we have lawyers get involved, we have expert witnesses testify to us under oath, and we make a decision. Those are our really big cases. Our second type of cases are the small ones where I was describing. They're making a simple tariff change. Somebody it's just minute little somebody wants to be a retail choice provider. Somebody wants to change a small rate with us. That will go through our administrative process where the commissioners meet once a week publicly to decide what they want to do. And in that process, our technical staff gives us a little write-up. Anyone else who has a concern can give us a filing, and we go through that. And I'm happy to give you a more formal write-up of that so you can give that to anyone who needs it. And then finally, the catch-all area where you kind of the supplier petition from the energy advocates, or I guess if we need new rules, we might just say, here's the issue, we want comments, and then we might create what's called a public conference where people can just get in front of us and testify about what they would like to see happen. We might have a rulemaking where we say these are how we are going to regulate these specific issues. In which case that will once again get comments, but then our commissioners will sit on the bench and have to make decisions live as we go. And then I guess kind of catch-alls like reports. So it's kind of broad. There's a lot of ways to do it, and I'm happy to also give you something more formal in writing that kind of lays all of that out too, because I know that there's a lot there.
And the comments are due on October 2nd. So anyone who did want to weigh in on the petition can submit comments to us. And I'd be happy to share the notice with more details with you, Senator Washington, or any of members of the committee who are interested.
Yeah, and just to put some context to this, I mean, when I originally started in this field, what the Public Service Commission mainly dealt with were rate proceedings filed by distribution companies looking to increase the price. Now what's come before the commission are more policy related issues. And so they get raised by a number of different parties. And so therefore the commission has to take a little different posture. It's still the same sort of process of having experts come before the commission and offer their opinions and comments, and then parties asking us to do or not do certain things, but it's not the strict financial analysis and rate setting that we go through in a utility rate case. It's a much broader examination that we do.
Thank you for that. That was really helpful.
Okay, Ben, back to you.
All right. All right, so on to the rate setting. So the very formal procedure I was just describing, great segue. So electricity and gas rates, as I was describing earlier, are set to recover their prudently incurred cost. So basically, we go through the whole point of this proceeding is to open up the utilities books and to determine what they spent, if what they spent is appropriate, and should they get cost recovery for it from the ratepayer. If it is determined to be prudent, it would be put into rate base, which is basically where I'll explain that in a second. So, but basically it's put into customer rates for recovery with a return added on top. We have our technical staff, the Office of People's Counsel. We'll also have the Sierra Club. We will have the apartment buildings and offices of Greater Washington. And a bunch of other interveners will show up and say, we have an opinion on this. We have experts that we're willing to put on the stand to testify. And basically, everyone will ask each other questions and write up expert testimony on various issues within the case, saying, this is what my opinion is and what the utility's ultimate rate should look like. And we will, during that process, we will we're actually about to have that happen starting tomorrow in the BG&E rate case, where basically we will go through a week-long hearing where we will hear that testimony live. They will be under oath, the witnesses, getting asked questions. And then after that, the commission will make its decisions and then issue a written order. The public can participate in this. And I think that's another thing I wanted to talk to you about, Senator Washington, was in our proceedings, sometimes the general public, they might not be able to offer expert testimony, but we still want to hear from them. So we will usually have public comment sessions where basically the members of the public can come in front of the commission virtually and also physically to say, these are my opinions on the filing. I support it or I don't support it. You don't typically see somebody who supports a rate increase, but you'll hear the general. We'll hear from the members of the public, and we also encourage them to file written comments with us as well. So, and that happens not just in the rate case, but that can also happen in other proceedings as well. It's just the rate case is probably the most, I guess, advertised of our big proceedings. And so within a rate case, we might also handle other items that are not just strictly the wires and that are used to, or the pipes used to move the gas and electricity. We might also have other programs that are in there for cost recovery. I don't show Struck and Power doesn't go through this process, but things like electric vehicles and the pilots, energy storage pilots, those costs will get run through the rate case. Typically, not all the time, but typically they will come through. Occasionally we will do it outside the case through a surcharge, such as in power. And then, as I've said before, we don't set retail rates. Brett, hop on in.
Yeah, and Ben, I was just going to add to that point right before I see Senator Brooks. You have a question, but I was just going to add for like certain pilot programs, like energy storage being one. Those are typically for, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, but those are typically set aside as a regulatory asset and then put into the base rates into a rate case. So they are recovered that way. And Senator Brooks, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, why don't you go on? Yeah, go on. You're up.
Yes. Yeah, quickly, Brett. Yeah, you're talking about the rate case and cost recovery. And under normal conditions, cost recovery would be through what we call depreciation in the accounting world. So, and I'm sure that the utility companies are not recovering that particular cost, but still getting depreciation. So I guess they'll just choose one or the other. But why? Yeah. If I were a cab company, I bought a vehicle and I use it for my business, and I would recover that cost through depreciation, So perhaps if you can speak to that a little.
Yeah. So I think,
And go ahead.
Yeah. So I think let me break cost recovery into two components for you.
Okay.
You're hitting it on the head, Senator Brooks. So every pipe that's put in the ground, every electricity pole that's put up that is deemed prudent, we will call what's called rate base, basically plant and service. And that we are going to basically create a bunch of loans, mortgages. Think of them as mortgages, or if you're obviously familiar with the accounting world, but for those of us who might not be, I like to simplify it to think of it as we basically create a bunch of mini mortgages for all this plant, that the mortgage goes over the useful life of the asset. And so basically we will pay for that asset over its entire useful life, so over 30, 40, 50 years. And they basically get a return on the undepreciated portions of that plant. And so that is one part of the customer's rates that they will pay. The other part of the customer's rates is the annual expenses to operate. So basically employee labor, the pens and pencils that you're using. So it's the basically what your annual expenses are also added on top, and they're paid for. And so basically that's supposed to represent what you're paying on average in a year to just keep everything moving, keep the utility moving forward. But all the components of plant that's used to serve the customer, you're right, those are depreciated over time and they earn a return on that. And that depreciation, for those who are not as familiar with it, think of it as a little mortgage. We basically have a bunch of mortgages that get bundled up into one big bundle, and then we pay for through utility rates.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Ben and Brett, back to you on distribution rate setting.
Yeah. All right. So then types of rate cases. So we have two types of rate cases. How we have historically done them is basically we just look at what the utility spent in the previous year, and we normalize it for basically expenses and costs that we think will or will not occur in the future. So it's really just saying what was history. We assume history is going to continue to repeat itself, and that is how. Go ahead,
yeah, Ben, I was just going to add, and those are typically, so we have a test year of the historical spend, and those will typically just be, okay, for 1 year or the short-term sort of indefinite future, what is that spend going to be? So yeah, go ahead, Ben. I just want to add that.
So basically it's assuming what happened previously will continue into the future. It is a fixed price based off of what happened previously. It's observable, and we can review, basically reviewing all the assets at that time for prudency and determining should or should they not get cost recovery of it. And that is how we have historically handled our rate cases. A couple of years ago, we stood up the multi-year rate plan, where basically we allow our utilities to project what they think their spend is going to be for the next 3 years. And so we basically, using those projections, would set the customer rates based off of those projections. At the end of those 3 years, the utility comes back before us. We look at what was spent versus what was actually collected. We do and that's where we do the prudency review. If at that point in time we true it up and we say, did the utility appropriately, or should the utility get cost recovery for what it has already collected? And do we need to do any refunds? Do we need to collect more from customers? And then that will get fixed. And so this is, I guess, a brand new type of proceeding that we are participating in. We are currently piloting it with Baltimore Gas and Electric, who's in front of us, for their second MYP. So this is where we are doing that first true up, where we look over the previous 3 years. Well, in this case, 2 years. We'll do the third after. But we look over the previous amount of time to determine, did you spend it correctly? What kind of spend did you have? What did you collect? Should we increase or decrease rates based off of that? And then on top of that, they are projecting another 3 years. And then we are going through the same process of determining what should their budget be for the next 3 years for this. And so we've have 3 of them up. We basically were kind of in a pilot status, but we did allow 2 other utilities to do it, but they are not the pilot utilities. So the Exelon utilities currently have multi-year rate plans, where basically we are using this projected approach to set customer rates. That's new. We're trying to figure out how it works. Is it good? Is it not good? We're trying to understand all of that currently. And so that's what we are currently working on, actually. And so that's what the BG&E case is that we're going to be reviewing over the next week and a half, is this projected multi-year rate plan. And then finally, sometimes to our detriment, the utilities get to decide when they want to file. And so basically, the utilities, and this is much more important under the traditional rate case, because historically we would set your rate, and if you didn't need more money, you just wouldn't show up again for a long time. And so Potomac Edison, they finally showed back up again, but they were out for, I want to say, about 20, 25 years. So we had set their rates in the 90s. They didn't show up for a rate case again until almost 2020. It was like 2018. So versus we were seeing, this was kind of what led to multi-year rate plans, versus other utilities we were seeing were showing up every single year looking for another rate increase. And so the multi-year rate plan was a bit of a reaction to that as well, is that the fact that they were just showing up all the time, and there was a regulatory burden there as well. And so that's, I guess, a nuance versus a traditional versus multi-year rate plan. End of the day, the utilities ultimately should not be able to recover more than what we deem as prudent, plus the opportunity to earn a fair rate of return. And that should be the end goal of whatever rate case we do proceed in. How you get there is going to look different, though.
And actually, if I could fill in on one little piece. So this process actually does go in both directions. The commission has the authority to analyze a utilities company's revenues and rates. And if the company is over earning, the commission has the authority to actually lower the rate. And this happened back in the early 80s when companies had filed rate increase requests based on what was then high interest rates, even higher than what's going on now, and then decided to just stay there and keep those high rates of return, and were over earning was the term. And so a petition was filed by the Office of People's Counsel alleging that these companies, BG&E and Pepco and the rest of them, were actually over earning their authorized rates of return. The commission had a proceeding that led to a rate decrease. And historically, if you go back far enough, during the Great Depression, the Public Service Commission brought the utility companies in because the decision was that given the economic circumstances, the rates that were on file couldn't be justified. And so they lowered rates again to deal with the economic situation of the Great Depression.
And a more recent example of us reducing rates was there was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, where basically taxes assessed to companies were changed. And so we pulled all the utilities in front of us and said, you're going to reduce rates for this new tax regime. And so everyone's rates around that time were reduced to incorporate the new tax law as well. So we do it. It's unfortunately not as often as maybe consumers would like to see, but that is under our authority if needed. Other questions on this before I move on? All right. So procedures, I would say the biggest takeaway from this slide is we have to get a rate case done in 7 to 10 months. And that's under the statute. If we don't get it done in that time frame, we have some powers that allow us to go a little longer, but they're not great. They would result in rate increases occurring until we figured out what we wanted to do. And so ideally we get it done in the 7 to 10 months and we all move on. And so that's the takeaway there. That's the process is just depicted on this page if any of you had questions on that.
And Ben, I was just going to say, to put it into context, for the BGE rate case that's currently pending in front of the commission, we are right in between that public comment hearing and the evidentiary hearings, which Ben had previously stated. We're starting the evidentiary hearings tomorrow. So just as an example for how the rate cases go.
And then the three components to a rate case, we've already discussed the revenue requirement and cost of capital in detail. And that basically sets the size of the pie. The next thing is to determine who gets what portions for cost recovery. So we go through 2 steps when determining that. First is we have what's called a cost of service study. And so what is happening here is the utility witness and staff's witness and the Office of People's Counsel witness study the utilities business, and basically they take every single cost category and they make some theoretical assumptions to allocate those costs to each customer class based on what they perceive to be the individuals that caused the utility to spend that money. That is obviously a very imperfect process, but this idea is to try and ballpark who is basically causing me to spend this money. And so that is what that's the cost of service study. It comes up with what we would call the perfect, like what we would say is this is ideally how much money we should be getting from each customer class.
And
then
yeah, I don't know. Did you want to do the customer classes, Brett?
Yeah, I was just going to add one other thing. Ben had mentioned for the cost of service study, and the utilities can't really just put down, like, it's not just they put down whatever costs that they've incurred. There's a pretty large chunk of oversight over this in the sense that FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has specific guidelines on what costs go into what accounts. And the utilities have to make sure that they comply by where these costs go, so that whenever technical staff, OPC, other parties are looking into the utilities cost of service study, it's pretty straightforward. And yeah, Lisa, with that being said, just as an example, so there are multiple different customer classes that are existing within a rate class, and these can range anything between a residential like customer, which is just your basic, you have a house or a residence, and that's the electricity usage that you're paying into, all the way up to large customers, large industrial customers, and I can get into that in a little bit. But yeah, so those are the customer classes that typically will split out, or as Ben like to say, who gets the slice of pie. The residential customers get this. The transmission customers, which can be like railroads, like Amtrak, gets this chunk. The large companies like Walmart, your Target, gets this chunk. So that's how it's split across with cost of service and rate design there.
And then I just say one little thing to add in at the end there. These groupings of customer classes, what you're looking for is groupings where customers have similar cost and usage behaviors. And what I mean by that is you want to maybe study, how are you using energy and forcing me to spend money to serve your load? And so it'd be best to categorize, because we don't create many rates for each individual customer on the grid. We're just trying to ballpark and get into large groupings of customers to set those rates. Occasionally, if we have a very large, unique customer, we will set an individual rate just for them. But for the most part, it is really focused on grouping customers based off of similar causing behaviors and usage profiles. And with that, any other questions about the rate case before I turn it over to Brett, just to walk through the components of the customer's bills?
Well, let me just add one thing on that. So
yeah,
what usually happens in a rate case is you'll have a multiplicity of parties involved. The utility company who's looking to have the increase in rates, and then you have the Office of People's Counsel, who represents residential customers, the staff that represents the public interest, and then a collection of interveners who represent certain types of customers. And what will happen is the one side will be arguing to keep the revenue requirement as low as possible. So the Office of People's Counsel, the staff, and all these interveners are looking to have this revenue requirement, the pot of bucks that have to be shared, to be as low as possible. That's versus the company that is trying to support its revenue requirement. And then when you get to this rate design piece, then that sort of splits, because then you'll have the various customer groups arguing over what they should be required to pay based on various theories that Ben mentioned earlier. And so it's the commission's job to try and allocate the pot of dollars across the various classes of customers so that everybody is treated fairly in the end, and people are paying their fair share to support the service, but also mindful of what it takes for people to be provided service.
Okay, Ben, I don't see any other questions on this segment, so why don't you go to the breakout of the bill?
Great. So yeah, once again, I'm Brett Sproul, one of the advisors for the commissioners. And now, so this next section of the presentation will largely be covering the breakout of your typical electric and or gas bill. So I really like to think that this is kind of where the rubber meets the road. Everything that Ben had mentioned in the previous slides, this is where it all becomes reflected to all of your constituents, all the residents that are paying a bill. So the way that I'd like to structure this is kind of breaking down each of these rates that appear here. So as you can see on the slide here, this is a typical, I believe this is just a BGE bill. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this kind of style of bill. This is broken down. This customer, I believe this is just for electric rather than gas. And we'll get to the gas side in a bit. But as you can see, this right where underneath the bar graph there, it says this is a just residential customer. So this is most people, the billing period, and then the next scheduled reading. So underneath all of that, it shows here's how much you used. As I'm sure I'm talking to all of you guys are very familiar with how this goes. But the sections that a lot of residents and we get customer calls for questions about a lot of this is, where is everything going as far as what portions am I paying and what are they going towards? What is the reason for them? So with that being said, I'll start with the highlighted section here, which is the electric supply. So I'll probably refer back to our lovely diagram that Ben provided earlier. So the electric supply, a good way to think about it is, this is the generation side of the cost of your bill. So this is the specific cost of generation of the electrons that that you're using, that the customer is using. So this is just that cost of that mix of natural gas that the utility bids on. So the utility typically does this through a standard offer service bid process that the Public Service Commission oversees. For residential customers, there are 2 bids per year for contracts of 2 years in length. And these contracts start in June and October, which is when prices for residential customers change. Now, basically how this process goes, it's a very strict kind of blind bidding process by all of the utilities. They bid on the wholesale market, which is the PJM market. Thanks, Ben, for switching the slides. And what this means is that they're bidding on a certain amount of electricity to meet the customer's load, as we have previously talked about. So with that, they'll place their bids, and like I said, we have a very strict oversight of process over this, and we get a kind of breakdown of how the bidding process went, what the prices were per chunk of energy, which they call tranches. It basically means that this is the amount of energy that they are purchasing to provide all of the customers. And so they bid on this to meet the load of their customers in a given time period. And that basically, how that price changes is how your electric supply rates change over time. And like I said, these are typically done in June and October. Now, included within this electric supply charge that's on your bill, as I just broke down, that the first piece is that energy rate. That's literally the cost of generation. What are the costs of bringing these electrons to the distribution system? And this includes a administrative charge. This administrative charge is basically what are the administrative costs for providing this service to customers. There are 5 components, and really what they are is just what are the costs that the utility incurs to have this, which is the cost of the bidding process, the cost of being in front of the commission and paying for those employees, etc. The other portions are gross receipt tax. This is a tax, 2% tax on transmission service, the lines taking those electrons to the distribution system. And then this last portion is the PSC assessment, which is a surcharge. That's all of the money that the PSC and OPC gets to keep our building up and running, to keep all of our people doing the great work that they do. So that's where we get our chunk of change. So with
Brett, I'm sorry, may I jump in real quick there?
Yeah,
So yeah, I think most of you may already know, but we actually don't have any we don't use general funds. So when we're talking about the PSC budget, we're talking about special funds, the assessment that Brett's talking about. And in addition, we get some federal grant funds for the delegated authority we have for the federal gas pipeline safety regulation enforcement.
But just so everybody understands, I mean, we go through the same budget review process that every other state agency goes through. It's this, the difference is the money that is ultimately appropriated to the Public Service Commission and the Office of People's Counsel comes from this PSC assessment, which is assessed against the utility companies and the retail suppliers. It's almost like a user fee, I guess, in a sense, so that funds our operation.
Yeah, a great way to think of that is a user fee. I think that's a good way to think about that. And before I get to the next slide, one thing that I did want to further clarify. So this electric supply portion, this is completely separate from the distribution portion of the bill. So like I said, there's a specific bidding process for the utilities bidding on the amount of generation. And then there's a specific section for distribution, which I believe I will get to at the next slide, Ben, if you can switch.
Will do. One last thing I just wanted to point out, because I think this is important in case your constituent, when we sometimes we get in discussions a lot of time with customers, and you might have it happen as well. Retail suppliers. Sometimes a customer does not realize they have a retail supplier. And that's called slamming. That should not happen. But if that does happen, occasionally a way to identify it is the supplier's name should be showing up underneath the supply charges. So on the customer's bill, there should be an identifier that shows that that customer is using a retail choice provider. And so if you ever get if sometimes that might be an easy thing to first kick it off if somebody's complaining about a high bill, is to maybe go first look at the electric supply or the gas supply and see who is providing your supply. Is it a retail choice provider or your utility? And then after that, we would get into a conversation with them. Okay, well, did you set up a contract with them or did you not? And that would probably end up going through the CAD complaint process. But there should be an identifier on the bill, and this should be one of the areas I believe that you would see it is calling out your supplier. And sorry, we don't have an example picture of that for you, but that might be something that comes up with your constituents at some point. Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, great. So as I said, there's the separate process for the specific generation of those electrons and getting those electrons to the distribution system. And now the next section, so this BGE electric delivery section, which has a customer charge, Empower Maryland charge, and the distribution charge. So this is the portion that is set during a rate case, as we discussed previously. And these are all meant to recover the costs that the utility assumes by sending the electrons through BGE's wires, poles, the substations. This is everything after the generation of those electrons. And I'll refer, this is the portion past that dash line on the diagram that we presented to. So the first chunk is the customer charge. I can talk about the distribution charge as well. So thank you, Ben. So the customer charge, this is set during a rate case, as we had discussed previously, and this is a fixed charge. So this doesn't change no matter how much electricity you use in a given month. This is, I believe right now it's a $9 fixed charge, and this is intended just to collect a lot of the costs that you assume just by being a customer. It doesn't depend on usage. So this could be billing, meter reading costs, and what have you. The next charge is the Empower Maryland surcharge. Oh, Ben, if you could, yep, thank you. And this is a variable charge. I'm sure all of you senators are familiar with the Empower program. So these are the collected costs assumed by the utility for the utility providing these Empower specific programs like lighting appliance rebates, HVAC home performance, etc. So this is a variable charge based on your usage per month and can go up and down depending on your usage. And now getting to the distribution charges. Thank you, Ben. So this is everything that during a rate case, all of the costs that aren't collected through that fixed customer charge portion are typically then collected through the distribution charge. So this is meant to recover all of the costs to the grid caused by the customer's energy usage, is a good way to think about that. So these could be costs of substations, transformers on the lines, pole costs, the regulatory assets that we mentioned, which are the EV pilot programs, like a battery storage pilot, all of those costs that basically to get the electricity from across the wires that you see along the side of the road to your house, that's the charge that they are charging to the customers. And this one also depends on your usage of electricity. Ben, if
I
you
would
could
say probably a good way to characterize the distribution charges is for a residential customer, which is what we just walked through. Are this distribution charge, we call it the variable charge, that fixed customer charge. But then the Empower Maryland surcharge, that is a type of surcharge, but we sometimes have more than just Empower surcharges. So there's, I would say you have this variable rate that's supposed to encompass the main utility work for that we're recovering using your energy over time, that fixed component. But then we have a bunch of surcharges, and that was, I think, the reason we threw Empower up there, is that's an example of one type of surcharge that happens. For those of you that might have you might deal with businesses, or those of you who are maybe getting, or if you talk with somebody in the electric vehicle industry, there's a third type of charge that's assessed, which is a demand charge, which is basically charging the component for their most energy they used at a single moment in time within a month. And that type of charge impacts, and so there are customers out there, or sorry, so that's another way of us recovering our cost from typically commercial and industrial customers, and that is a point of contention within the electric vehicle industry currently, in a discussion that's been ongoing. And I see Senator Young has a hand up.
Thank you very much. So would this provision cover the increased demand of a high energy user, such as a data center that required substations, to ensure that those costs aren't spread out among the neighboring constituents?
Yes.
Ben, do you want to hit that one, or?
You go ahead first, then I'll back clean up.
Yeah, so a lot of like for the specific data centers that are being built within this state, there are specific processes for if they require those substation solely to serve them. There are processes to ensure that those costs aren't spread out to there are allocators within a rate case that effectively ensure that the costs are borne by whoever is causing the cost, which in this case would be the data center. So that data center and the customer class would pay a higher charge, and basically ensuring that those costs aren't spread out to customers. And Ben, if you want to add a couple of
points. So I think to simplify it a little bit, there's two ways that the data center or a customer like a data center would be assessed these costs. First, when somebody wants to connect to the electric grid, we will assess them a connection charge. For residential customers, that's a pretty, it's typically up to a certain amount. It's a pretty set amount what we would charge you. When we're talking about these larger customers, such as a data center, they will typically be required to pay their costs to connect them to the grid. Now, where I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage is I don't know personally where that delineation is. So they may or may not had to pay for some or all of the substation upgrade. Any costs, and if that is done, those costs have now been paid by that customer. They're not put into utility rates because those costs have been covered up front. We call that a cost to native construction. And that is typically done in the beginning. After that, though, if there's any cost associated with that were not paid for by that customer, they do go into the overall rate base. And this is now where we go to that cost of service study we were discussing, where we will, depending on how the customers are grouped, we will use certain components of a customer, such as their demand, to spread cost amongst the various customer classes. So in theory, if we do our job perfectly, then yes, there shouldn't be any subsidization by anyone because we appropriately got the cost spread to all the customers and established the rates. We don't live in a perfect world, so sometimes that doesn't happen. So that's where this push and pull tension between how much you can get covered up front through the kayak is important, or through subsequent contracts with such a large user. And so, but that would be the ways that you would target it. So in a perfect world, yes, we would avoid it. In an imperfect world, we have methods in place that trying to minimize that as much as possible.
And Ben, can you explain again the kayak cost allocation?
Cost to native, yeah, the kayak, the cost to native construction. basically that is a customer who we typically want to assess customers their cost to connect them to the system. That's what we would like to do. And so that is basically the utility is going to study them, look at them and say, here's how much it's going to cost to connect you. And then depending on the tariffs and the rules that we have in place, the customer will pay all or some of that cost to connect them to the grid. And so that cost native construction is basically their upfront payment to be connected to the grid.
Hey, Ben and Brett, just a little heads up. Some of our members, I think, have a hard break around noon. So to the extent, we can make our way through by then, that'd be ideal, but I don't want to.
Yep. I think we're.
Yeah, I can run through the rest of the slides pretty quickly, I think.
Can we skip back to these, Brett?
Yeah, I'll just hit on these. So the electric universal service program, that is a flat charge that's used to support OHAP, the Office of Home Energy Programs, and the specific universal service program that they provide. I believe it's set to 32 cents per month for residential customers. The environmental surcharge, this is a volumetric charge used to support the PPRP, or the Power Plant Research Program, to specifically support their establishment. And then the franchise tax. So this is funds that go to the state general fund. And this is just a variable tax on the utility based on electricity usage, or to the customer towards the utilities franchise tax. Great, and you can.
Actually, let me add one thing on the taxes and fees. There are certain local jurisdictions that impose a local tax, an energy tax, that is put on the utility bill. It's collected by the utilities, and the funds go to the local government. The Public Service Commission doesn't set that tax rate. We literally just authorize the pass-through on it. But you'll see that on some of the bills, a local tax aspect.
Great. Now getting to the gas portion of the bill, these are going to be very similar to how the electricity charges are set. There are going to be some slight differences. So Ben, if you could click to the next slide here. So there's a gas supply charge, a customer charge, distribution charge, and power charge. So these are all going to be collected in a similar manner that I mentioned regarding the electricity bill. One of the main differences on a gas bill is you will see this stride charge. Once again, I'm sure you were all familiar with the stride bill. And this specific plan, this is a surcharge that recovers the expenditures related to the company's stride plan, which accelerates the natural gas infrastructure and replacements, and is further approved by the PSC. And this charge is capped at a $2 per month maximum. So the utilities cannot charge over that $2 per month for residential customers. So that being said, yeah, we can go on to the next section. And Ben, do you want to hit on the electric and gas?
Yeah, I can finalize this more. So the last item we just wanted to show you is going back to that discussion I had earlier, that sometimes your constituents will use a provider who is not BG&E to get their generation and transmission served. So a retail choice provider. And so in order to sign up with these retail choice providers, they need to provide what is called their choice ID number, which is typically located on the bill. And so then this is an example of it that we have highlighted here. And so not much more to say on that. The customer would need to provide that. And then I would say the important thing to take away from this is we do sometimes have bad actors out on the market whose goal is just to get the customer on. And the easiest way to do that is to get a hold of the choice ID number. And so typically it would be advised to customers, don't just show your bill to anyone. If they want to sign up with a retail choice provider, you give them that choice ID number after you've assured yourself that you want to be with them, because sometimes we do have bad actors in the market who will take a look at the bill to get that number. Obviously, we have enforcement proceedings against said suppliers that do such things. We're monitoring the market for it, and we will engage in enforcement action against suppliers that don't follow the rules. But that is just one, I guess, protection component that is sometimes useful to pass on to customers, is to be careful who you show that front page of the bill to. All right, well, that is our presentation.
And thank you. Yeah, thank you, Ben and Brett. This is Lisa. And just to wrap up, Chair and Vice Chair and members, just want to let you know we were taking notes of some of the topics of interest, some of the questions we got. So Kathy or I will follow up with additional information. And we'd also love to meet with any of you all in your districts, or you're always welcome to come visit the PSC and see us in action. We do have our weekly administrative hearings on Wednesdays. And thank you so much for all of your time.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
well,
let me just
yeah, Mr. Chair,
saying,
Chair Hoover, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
just by saying, I mean, I'm head of a state agency and I understand my responsibilities to the members of the General Assembly, so I'm available for any questions that you have on either matters that are pending before us or legislative matters that come up next January, and I look forward to appearing before you in person starting in January.
Great. Okay, Vice Chair Kagan, you've got your.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you all. This was very helpful. And to me anyway, it seemed like it was the right level of high level and basic. So thank you for that. I have a question that, just since we had a few extra minutes, that I just want to ask, that goes back a while in the presentation, which was about your capacity, your authority over citing. I just want to go to my notes for 1 second. PSC has citing authority, and I just wonder if Chair Hoover or anyone can speak about what's considered, and is there consumer community impact? What about environmental justice? What is the impact and stuff? Can you just talk about that?
Sure. So Maryland has a fairly extensive process and procedure for determining the siting of energy facilities. And traditionally it was large scale power plants that ran on coal or natural gas, and or in one case, nuclear energy. Now it's more related to renewable resources. So the utility scale solar projects and the land-based wind projects. So all of those things, the developers submitted application to the Public Service Commission to get what's known as a certificate of public convenience and necessity, basically a license to build from us in order to construct these things. That then goes to the power plant research program. They bring in a multiplicity of state agencies who analyze the project for its impacts on a wide variety of things, both environmental, but also cultural and things like that. They make a list of recommendations to the Public Service Commission. We also invite participation by the people that are living in the area affected by the energy facility, as well as the local governments. All of those entities participate in a proceeding before the Public Service Commission, and we review the application, the comments that are made on it, and most importantly, the list of recommendations provided by the state agencies through the power plant research program, and then ultimately make a decision as to whether or not to grant the certificate. Once that's granted, then the facility can start its process of actual construction. They still need to get the local permits that any construction project needs to get. But what it does do, it does override any sort of zoning concerns that may come up. So that's essentially how the process works.
So I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, just a quick follow up. So you talked about community testimony and engagement and stuff. Are there rules and expectations or practices as to how community members would hear about something that would be proposed to be in their community?
Well, just like, with any other, like with any government situation, the applicant is actually required to give public notification through various local media contexts. I mean, historically it had been in newspapers, and now we're looking for other ways of doing that. So,
but it's on the utility, not the PSC. The utility,
not the PSC. I mean, but we oversee, we review. I mean, part of the filing they make, the applicant has to show to us the outreach that they have done to the local community to let them know that this project is a potential neighbor of theirs.
Lisa, I don't want to take more of the committee's time on this, but I'm interested in learning details about that. Exactly.
Okay.
The expectations, what the mileage circumference is, how they're doing it, because different people with different languages, different internet access, different, educational levels are going to have different ways of learning or not learning about something that might happen in their community. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Can I just
Okay,
I want to throw 2 cents on. So first of all, this issue has been very controversial in terms of the interplay between the Public Service Commission and local government over the years. In fact, one of the cases, perennial, went all the way to the High Court of Maryland to try to figure out if you've got a conflict between local zoning and siting issues and the Public Service Commission, who wins? And the court said that it's the Public Service Commission. They can take due note of local recommendations or concerns, but at the end of the day, the PSC essentially preempts and is top dog. Having said that, we had a bill in the committee this session where the interpretation of that case was by MACO had a different interpretation of a bill that we had in the committee. So I don't want to leave the impression that this is sort of this is still a muddy watered kind of topic. And in fact, the citing issue was a topic of a letter that Chair Wilson and I actually sent to Governor Moore within the last few weeks, just sort of putting this issue of citing back on the radar screen. But nonetheless, this has been a topic, even our own local government, Madam Vice Chair, we have citing issues in the Ag Reserve, and we had zoning issues about solar, and there was pushback. So this is still, I think, not a clean topic, although the court has spoken there. Again, I think MACO may have a different interpretation than I think myself and some other folks had of that court case. I don't want to muddy the waters too much, Mr. Chair Hoover, but it is a big subject.
Well, actually, just to give sort of a preview of coming attractions, I guess, I actually saw a copy of the letter that you sent to Governor Moore and read through it. I have reached out to the solar industry, the developer community, the local governments, PPRP, and I am going to be trying to undertake a process to try to get all these parties together to discuss the current process and potential changes to that process to try to lower the temperature maybe on some of these siting things. Because I've been aware of the controversy, around the state and trying to cite these projects. There are different mandates that we're operating under. We have the RPS that requires a certain amount of renewable energy that the General Assembly's enacted and we have to implement. But on the other hand, we have this pressure from the local communities and the local governments about the project placement and things like that. So I will be working through that in some process or form. It may eventually need to be a legislative fix. If so, I'll be coming to see you, but I'm going to try to see what I can do within.
Well, I think to be continued, and I know Senator Hester, this has been a topic she's been very much out front as well on the issue of citing, and so any other questions before we adjourn? I did just want to say I thought we blocked off 10 o'clock to noon. I thought this was time well spent by the committee, and I hope everybody agrees. Any kind of final questions for either Chair Hoover? I do want to thank Team PSC, Lisa, and Ben and Brett and Chair Hoover for participating, and Alexis in our own office for putting this together. Any, again, final questions before we adjourn for the day? I did want to just also remind everybody, I want to give a belated thank you to Senator Carrozza, who had to hop off the call for the boat ride in Ocean City at MACO. We've got a PJM visit on September 12th. We were going to go up to Galleon territory in October at some point for Conewango Dam visit, and he has a special add-on treat when we get up there. That will be a date in October. I see Senator Galleon here. So I think we're in a good role, and I want to keep everybody interested, invested in these topics, again, to set us up for January. But any other closing questions, comments by anybody on the committee or outside the committee? Okay, we're almost exactly noon, so the timing's perfect. With 1 minute, I'm going to give everybody